Good afternoon. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I run a program on Central Asia here at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And I want to welcome you to the very first event of this calendar year that the program is doing. And we are starting at a very kind of with a bang on a very high note. By hosting John Heathershaw and Tom Mayne, the authors of the book Indulging Kleptocracy, British Service Providers, Postcommunist Elites, and Enabling of Corruption, that is coming out officially this month, both in the UK and the US, but it is already selected as one of the best books of year 2024 by Foreign Affairs, which is quite a feat. And kleptocracy is an evergreen topic, and unfortunately, it's probably one of the 10 or 20 words that come to mind when Central Asia kind of in international affairs is discussed. But I think timing now is particularly it is particularly timing. To have this book out, especially in this country. So I'm very happy that we have you with us today. And before I forget, I also wanted to kind of to flag this leaflet with the discount code.
Yeah, the discount code.
It's a discount code. You can get 30% off. Buying this book from Oxford University Press. You can pick it up there next to sandwiches. So let me introduce the speakers, and then I'll give the floor to you. So Professor John Heathershaw is Professor of International Relations at the University of Exeter. His research addresses conflict, security, and development in global politics, especially in Central Asia. He is the author of a number of books. One of them is Post-Conflict Tajikistan, published by Routledge, Dictators Without Borders, a book authored with Alexander Cooley, and the UK's Kleptocracy Problem, published by Chatham House in 2021. He's also the author of many peer-reviewed journal articles. He's currently the principal investigator of a research project which seeks to identify the characteristics of kleptocratic enabling networks, an analysis of the data of the organized crime and corruption reporting project. Next to him, we have Tom Mayne. Thomas Mayne is a research fellow at University of Exeter, visiting fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Prior to this, he worked as a senior campaigner at anti-corruption NGO Global Witness, where he was responsible for the group's reports on Central Asia and Eurasia. Very famous reports. I want to thank you for those. Wonderful readings. His current research project builds on his expertise in analyzing kleptocratic flows by looking at networks of professional service providers that enable illicit flows from corruption hotspots. So thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nargis. The projects you mentioned that Tom and I are working on now are working with civil society and journalists. And I think one thing that will be clear from this presentation is that I think a lot of the most interesting research, certainly from my perspective on this topic, requires that interaction with journalists and civil society who do deep investigative work. The book is also available on Oxford Scholarship Online, so through the Harvard Library. It's there electronically, of course, and I think that's why Foreign Affairs picked it out in 2024. It was due to initially be published in October or November of last year, but then Oxford changed the dates, I think largely because to write a book like this, extensive legal review is quite important, and that takes some time and was a little bit delayed. So Nargis mentioned Dictators Without Borders, which is a book I wrote with Alexander Cooley in 2017. That was really focusing on the demand side of what you could call the kleptocracy problem. So if you are in power, you're exercising a form of rule, you want to act globally, and your primary interests are personal and private, not public or national. How do you do that? How do you access the offshore companies, the legal and financial services? That was the question we were asking. In this book, based on the research that the three of us, and this includes Tena Prelec, our co-author, who will join us tomorrow when we go down to present this at Columbia University, we wanted to focus on the supply side. So flipping it around, the focus being on the British financial and legal service providers that are providing a set of services. And in some cases, quite a few cases actually, we would say generating demand for those services. So we can't simply assume that it's a kind of what you might call inside out problem where it comes from the regimes themselves. It can be just as much about a set of services being provided transnationally. And that's the perspective we take in this book. Now, as Nagi's mentioned, this is a problem that has current currency, if you can say that. The kleptocracy problem, we collectively wrote this report in 2021 with Chatham House, which got a lot of attention in the UK about this provision of financial and legal services to what you might call oligarchs and kleptocrats. And I'll come on to that in a little bit. And that precisely around that time, a huge escalation of interest in the phenomenon of kleptocracy occurred in the British public sphere particularly, but I think beyond that too. Now, that wasn't so much about our report. It was partly about our report, actually. It gained some attention, but it was mainly, of course, about the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and then the sanctions that followed that. And picking up on work by people like Canon Dewisha, of course, Catherine Belton, the British journalist, Oliver Bullough, Tom Burgess, other UK journalists who've written on this phenomenon. So what we see is this spike of interest. This is mentions of Parliament. We see these are just figures up to June 2022, but of all mentions, almost half of them occurred over a 6-month period, more than half of them in the 5 years from 2017 to 2022. Kleptocracy is a term which sort of re-entered or entered modern English usage in the early 19th century. That's why I've done the chart here, but it's really been picked up as a new term to refer to grand corruption in recent decades, and particularly in the last few years. So we're going to deal with the phenomenon of Londongrad, as it's sometimes called, as an exemplary case, and this is what we do in the book, to try and tell the wider story about kleptocracy, this rule by thieves, and how we should understand that. Enabling, which is the supply of the services, the financial and legal services, and then try and begin to make some causal claims about why this happens. And also think finally about some of the wider effects. So we're going to go back and forwards. I'll hand over to Tom in a moment. I'm just going to set up some of the sort of theory and method. The book is a hybrid academic trade book. So we're light on theory and method in the book, but when presenting to academic audiences, I want to spend a little bit more time on that so you can see the premises from which we are operating. So firstly, what is kleptocracy? So the traditional way of understanding kleptocracy would be as a sort of regime type, and certainly as something which is spatially national. So, a elite controls a government, and by that means it is able to extract wealth from its society. And I think this is what the recently Nobel Prize winning economists, Darren Ashimoglu, James Robinson, and their co-author Thierry Verdier were thinking about when their paper on kleptocracy was published 20 years ago, where it says kleptocratic regimes, they use the term regimes, exist where the state is controlled and run for the benefit of an individual or small group who use their power to transfer a large fraction of society's resources to themselves. And I've picked up on that final bit because this is where the definitional conundrums, I think, arise. So essentially, yes, there is a form of rule here, which involves the fusion of wealth and power, the fusion of business and politics. But that rule, it does not necessarily mean a regime type. So we don't think about kleptocracy as a subset of autocracy. Some definitions think of it like that. Jody Laporte, very good scholar of Azerbaijan and former Soviet Union at Oxford, thinks about it as a form of autocracy, for example. But it's not a regime type. It does require rule, but it's not equivalent to democracy, autocracy. And the key is that final part of the definition there, of transfer of a large fraction of society's resources to themselves, because that transfer is always global in scope. You do not want to be a kleptocrat purely in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. You need it in dollars or euros. You need it secure in offshore accounts or bank accounts or listed companies. But most important of all, it isn't just about the money. It's also about the status, the influence that comes with wealth. And so that requires things that we look at in the book, such as citizenships and residencies by investment. It includes political donations. It includes philanthropic investments. It includes a variety of corporate intelligence services and litigation services that go beyond simply managing money. That is the whole mixture. And when we talk about a transfer of a fraction of society's resources to themselves, it's occurring through those mechanisms, and it's occurring globally, sometimes simultaneously in Tajikistan, British Virgin Islands, Sweden, New York, Switzerland, London. That would be one case that I previously studied. So therefore, we need to think about kleptocracy as being global and specifically transnational, crossing borders. So our longer, more verbose definition is kleptocracy is the transactions, relationships, and networks. This is a network-based account operating across borders for a person or entity whose wealth is fully or partially a product of kleptocratic rule. So it's about the sources of wealth being linked to that rule, but it's not about a particular regime type. To hide and protect assets, so that's the core economic action, but also acquire status and achieve influence in a third country or countries. So it's about reputation laundering as well as money laundering. And it means also that it involves a series of characters, not all which would strictly be a kleptocrat, so someone who's exercising rule. In economic crime law, that would be a politically exposed person, a member of the ruling elite, or a close family member or associate. But persons involved in this, very often are in business, they're wider family members, they're part of these transnational networks, and they include the service providers themselves. So kleptocracy is political, it is global, but it's also professional. And this is where the supply of services by transnational professionals come in. There is a global market of provision where demand can be created by finding loopholes in the law between one jurisdiction and another and achieving a certain amount of compliance. So we're not talking about directly criminal behavior here. The cases that we'll come to in a moment involve some of the biggest law firms, largest financial services companies, big real estate agents. So professional enablers we define as individuals or organizations that facilitate transactions between two or more parties, at least one of whom has a source of wealth which is illicit, not necessarily illegal. If it's coming from a place where there's kleptocratic rule, it's extremely unlikely, unless they're an exile and the enemy of that home government, that it will have been declared illegal. So it won't be illegal, but by a common legal standard, we could at least consider it illicit. It will be wealth accrued through use of violence or political connections or payoffs. So, for example, this also has a kind of own, well, for example, there's a narrative of justifying this. So the reason I've picked the pictures up there of Gulnara Karimova and Mohammed Amersi is one of our cases in the book that we discuss in various points is Mr. Amersi's provision of mergers and acquisition support to the Swedish-Finnish telecoms company Telia Sonera when it was entering the Uzbek telecoms market. That was a market essentially controlled by Gulnara and her network, and she acquired around about $1 billion worth of payments over a few years for access into that market. But what I probably won't read from the book for the sake of time, but Amersi's own justification of that, we talk about how there's a transaction involved there where he got a $500,000 success fee for a few weeks' work over 2009-10. He was paid about $65 million for his work with that company over 4 to 5 years in various jurisdictions. So it's a provision of services, and this is maybe where contemporary events in America, the suspension of the action of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This is an FCPA case. Teliasonera is important because it was, by his definition, normal business. Actually, I will read the quote from Mercy in the book where he says, this is in writing to us. We gave him opportunity to comment on the contents of the book, as you do. He wrote back within 7 hours, all caps, to my vice chancellor, the head of the University of Exeter, demanding I be fired from my professorship from professional misconduct, and wrote, the logical extension of your argument is that endemic institutional corruption was so notorious in Uzbekistan that no legitimate company, businessman, or advisor who wished to conduct business there would have contemplated conducting business. This is obviously wrong and unsupportable. The point of the book to show is that in a place and environment like Uzbekistan, he's right. Let's take those words seriously. Let's listen to them. So we can evidence this case, but we know that. And I think this is the implication of some of that executive order of Trump, that it really does get in the way, the FCPA, of like getting into these markets and getting critical minerals. So this is the conundrum. Telia did it. Telia paid. Telia was convicted on the FCPA. And obviously, with the recent changes, statute limitations being 5 years, Trump will be gone, and companies know there's a legal jeopardy there. But still, the possibility that such future actions would not be prosecuted is worrying if you're at all concerned about economic crime. Okay, so that is kleptocracy. Let's say a little bit more about enabling and how it's covered in the book before I hand over to Tom to dig into some of the cases. So we have 9 chapters which have single or small number of cases which we compare. And we're trying to identify, obviously, why there is this effect of what we call indulging kleptocracy. I'll detail that in a moment, what we mean by indulging and how it's different from sort of accessory forms of enabling. So our concern here is not about corruption in itself, but it's enabling, or what we call indulgence. That was Luther's concern too. People think the Reformation was about Luther's concern with corruption of the Catholic Church, but it was specifically about the professional enabling of the clergy. That was Luther's concern, and that's the metaphor we use. There's this moral and reputational dimension to this too, which we really want to pay attention to in the book, and that's why the latter half of those cases, you see that the sectors in the brackets, and what we call the indulgence in the capital letters, the latter half of those, from really explaining wealth downwards, very much to do with status and reputation, and more broadly influence. They go beyond the simple matter of moving money. The way it all fits together might be like this. So you can see it's some demand from the top, but we're interested in the supply. We're starting here, these sectors, and how the client's demands to have their money and themselves sometimes hidden, protected, legitimized, and influential are being met by professionals in these sectors through these indulgences here in the middle. So one can see it in terms of demand, of course, but one can equally see it in terms of supply. So when we're thinking about enablers here, we're using indulgence to capture behavior which is in a kind of gray area. I love Kimberly K. Hwang. Kimberly is a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and she talks about this gray space between legal and illegal practices. That's largely what indulgence is. Some definitions of this, particularly the ones in law, are necessarily, I suppose, focus on criminal activity. But they're trying to, when they define enabler as engaging in a kind of criminal or criminally negligent activity, they're really just coming close to a definition of a criminal accessory. We're talking about, sometimes accessory behavior is present in our cases, but it's more unusual, more common is the indulgence. And that's where there's a certain, they're almost always compliant with the law. There's some willfulness here in kind of getting around and avoiding regulations, but there's this element of being willfully unwitting quite often. So just making sure you don't take those extra enhanced due diligence measures where you do know about the sources of wealth of your client. If you're not a legal professional with client confidentiality and you do know about the source of wealth, then you're in a gray area. And yeah, I'll stop at that for the interest of time and move on. So it's the indulgences on that side. This from Tena's work with our colleague at Oxford, Ricardo Suarez de Oliveira. But this conceptual notion of enabling being willful or unwitting, compliant or non-compliant. It's this part of the axis that we're particularly interested in the book. So we end up with a kind of policy problem and a politics problem. And the policy problem is why we get asked to talk to government and economic crime investigators about this. How do you detect this, and how do you regulate against it? But the politics problem is the one we're kind of more interested in, which is the problem of transnational kleptocracy, where it actually gets a new nature of global politics, I suppose, where there are network forms of relationships between political business elites and professionals. So how does one explain that? We think there's kind of three ways of kind of maybe getting at that, and three academic literatures which point to those correspondingly. Firstly, an alliance effect. So in international relations, you might say, well, obviously this is a big phenomenon. If you're a Gulf elite in the UK, you basically get a free pass. Whereas if you're Russian, well, we're going to sanction you. That kind of seems to fit the alliance effect. Secondly, an incumbency advantage, which kind of comes from comparative political economy. You say, well, really it is control of the regime that matters. And an exile is going to have a problem because the regime back home is going to find plenty of evidence. It's going to make mutual legal assistance requests. It's going to go after that wealth overseas. So maybe there's an incumbency advantage. If you're incumbents, you can claim sovereign immunity sometimes, and you can certainly use your relationships with the foreign states to protect your own assets and extend your own influence. And a third explanation, which is the one we're most interested in, is enabler effect. And this is coming more out of criminology and sociology of professions literature. It says that transnational networks matter. It's the supply of services which creates demand. It's the innovation of professionals in getting around certain rules, achieving compliance, achieving some of this willfully unwitting behavior, which allows indulgence to occur. Okay, so we're almost going to get into the cases, but just to summarize that, I've sort of picked it out with some of the kind of literatures that you may be a little bit familiar with there. So if it's an alliance effect, then we'd see a really big difference between allies being treated in one way, and of course the opponents of enemies as well. So some exiles, say Russian exiles in the UK, may be treated more fairly than, say, a Russian who's got a clear connection to Putin. If it's incumbency that matters, we'd expect to see all exiles, whether they're from an ally or not, suffering, and maybe less likely to be able to move their money around, less likely to get influence, more likely to lose the property that they've bought in the west of London. If it's an enabler effect, we'd expect to see all those who have a certain level of wealth and can afford to contract high-level financial and legal services to succeed and to be able to hide and transfer those assets and to achieve influence and status. So just a little thing on method, handing it over to Tom. So we're trying to build theory really here. We're trying to say it's a general explanation, because there's been individual books and articles written on one or more of these sectors. But what we want to do is try and generalize across them. It's mainly qualitative analysis of post-communist cases. We use descriptive statistics. We do a bit of qualitative comparative analysis. I think what we do most is most similar sets of cases where you can see there might be one difference, like incumbency versus exile, and see how that matters. Tom will go over a case of that soon. And we've got some exemplary single cases too. We also just try and give an overview of the literature in each of the sectors, which is quite a lot of ground to cover. The opportunity to comment process and our direct experience of interviewing professionals gives us a certain amount of ethnographic aspects. We've also been called on to do a fair amount of expert witness testimony and professional work in this area, and that gives you a little bit of an insight on cases. We're then able to do within case process tracing to look at whether there's an alliance effect, an incumbency advantage, or an enabler effect. But we also want to assess this according to what our respondents, our subjects, are saying when in the opportunity to comment process. And you do sometimes get really great data that way. Okay, I've gone on too long, so I'm going to hand over to Tom to talk about some cases for 15 minutes or so before we conclude.
Thanks, John. I always joke I get to talk about the fun stuff, although perhaps fun isn't quite the word. Yeah, we have our 9 indulgences there, our 9 professional practices. I'm going to concentrate on 3, 5, and 6, a little bit on 4 as well. And basically what we set out to do was to explore which of those 3 factors that John mentioned is key in deciding whether an indulgence is granted, whether money is laundered, whether a property is bought, whether a donation is accepted. And so let's take the first one. And this one is the issue of selling rights, basically acquiring passports. Yeah, go back now. Yeah. And I think this is a great example of what John was talking about when he was saying, you know, the professional services, the lawyers, the enablers, they are not in many cases fulfilling a demand. They are actually creating a new product. They're creating a demand. 60 years ago, no one was really hankering after a passport from St. Kitts and Nevis. Only people who would want to do that is perhaps if you've moved there. But what these companies did that offered these passport by investment schemes was basically say, you know, tacitly, you know, the understanding was you can forget your past. You can, with a passport, move assets more easily. You can travel more easily with a new passport. You can, if your country, this political situation goes south, you can perhaps set up a home in the country where you have a passport. You're a citizen, right? The UK did something similar after the financial crash in 2008. We slightly changed our rules. We introduced the T1 investment visa, which basically said that if you invested £1 million in the UK, you would have a right to live in the UK. For 6 years between 2008 to 2014, what we call the blind faith period, where there were basically no checks by the UK government on the people applying or on the source of wealth. And what did we find? We found that the vast majority of applicants for the Tier 1 investment scheme is from China and Russia, with a 92% success rate. We have highlighted there the post-Soviet kleptocracies, but what's also interesting is, I think, with this particular indulgence, if we're talking about one of the factors, whether a person is an incumbent or a political enemy of a particular regime, it really doesn't matter. In this particular case, the companies providing this service are kind of equal opportunity enabler, and I think some of the examples we go through in the book bear that out. It's quite maybe hard to read. We're not really concentrating on potential harms that can be brought to the UK or the country which is providing the enabling services, but just a few examples there. About half of all the Tier 1 investment visas were reportedly being reviewed for security concerns in the UK. 53% of the passports that issued in Cyprus were deemed to be unlawfully given. So there's some real big issues here. And centre to the whole scandal or the whole issue is this company, Henley and Partners, who are described as the market leaders. And as I say, it was they who really came up with the idea, popularised the idea, and would do such things as advise St. Kitts to remove place of birth from passport, making it more attractive to kleptocrats and to other people to acquire that particular passport. Some examples of people who've got visas and passports on the right. Cyprus, the Cyprus case was very mired in corruption. Ongoing is a criminal trial of a politician who's alleged to have basically taken money to fix certain passport deals. There's a great documentary on YouTube by Al Jazeera, which basically went undercover to film lawyers. There's a Cypriot lawyer who basically boasts, within 10 minutes, I can get you a new passport with a new name. You can immediately understand why that would be a problem, but he's kind of boasting about it on camera. Portugal had a similar scheme to the UK. There was also quite a famous case of a different way that you could get a passport in Portugal. If you could prove that you had Sephardic Jewish roots, you could also get a passport. Apparently one rabbi is alleged to have basically given this to anybody who came along, including to Abramovich, who, as far as we know, doesn't have any Sephardic Jewish roots. He has Ashkenazi roots. So you can clearly see how these schemes are open to corruption. But this one's an interesting one because the incumbency and the ally nation doesn't really seem to play into it so much. If we move on to buying properties, here is where we see that there is a real incumbency advantage. If you are a member of a ruling family member or an associate, it is very rare that you will lose that property. So for a prior report, a report we did for Chatham House, we produced a database of £2 billion worth of properties purchased by high-risk and politically exposed people in the United Kingdom, and we looked at what happened to those properties. We found that if the person who held that property retained political power or their family member, in no cases did they lose that property. Was there an investigation where that property was frozen or seized? Yet, if that person was to fall out of political favour and become an exile and have to leave and go to the UK or wherever, we found of the 15 examples where we had exiles owning property, 12 of those 15 properties, 80% were actually seized. So this isn't obviously because exiles are more corrupt than incumbents. It's because we can see how when you lose political favour, or there is an effort on behalf of the new powers to provide the evidence to the UK, to whoever, for that property to be frozen. If you're in power, obviously it's much harder for the UK authorities or whoever it is to go after it, because they're just not going to be able to get the evidence to prove on the balance of probabilities that that property has been bought with the proceeds of crime. And no better example of this was a case we cover in the book regarding the unexplained wealth order cases in the United Kingdom. An unexplained wealth order was brought in 2018 in the UK as a new way of trying to tackle kleptocracy. It basically said that if you are a politically exposed person and you own a house in the UK and you can't explain how you came up with the wealth to purchase that house, you can have that property potentially, frozen, potentially seized. And there were two cases which were very similar, and this is a most similar case, different outcome illustration. We had Jahangir Hajiev, whose wife famously spent, I think, £10 million in Harrods over a 10-year period. They had a property, and the unexplained wealth order was used, and he lost his property. Yet another case, another unexplained wealth order was issued against Dariga Nazarbayeva and her son Nurali Aliyev, and that unexplained wealth order case failed, even though the cases were very similar. Jahangir Hajiev is a bank chairman who basically used his own bank to loan himself some money, bought himself a house. Nurali Aliyev was the chairman of a bank, basically loaned himself some money to buy a house in London. Same kind of situation. Yet Jahangir Hijiev lost the property. Nurali Aliyev and Dariga Nazarbayeva retained the property. Why is that? And that one reason could be because Dariga Nazarbayeva and Nurali Aliyev, at the time of the unexplained wealth order, their father, in the case of Dariga, was still the president of Kazakhstan. And the judge said, rather naively, in my view, well, the Kazakh prosecutor has said that all these assets have been legally acquired, so there's no case to answer. Hijiev couldn't do that because he'd fallen out of favor in Azerbaijan, and that is why he lost the property, lost the case. So, to conclude, what is which of our three factors seems to win out when we're looking at our 9 services, our 9 indulgences? It seems that the enable effect is the strongest. And just to give you a few examples, Maxim Bakiev, the son of the former president of Kyrgyzstan, basically used various banks in Kyrgyzstan to launder money, to take money out of the country. And it was alleged that his family took between $200 and $300 million out of the country, leading up to the time that his father was deposed in a revolution. Gulnara Karimova, daughter of the Uzbek president, she received $1 billion in bribes. John mentioned it earlier. She bought property in the UK and managed to sell a couple of those properties, even when things were starting to fall around her. And Mohammed Amersi has used professional services to silence critics using the UK's very stringent libel laws. And in these 3 cases, what we find is that it is the enabler effect which is key. So, in relation to Maxim Bakiev in Kyrgyzstan, the Bank Asia Universal Bank at the beginning of Bakiev's reign was actually in quite a difficult position. Russia had given a notice that had said that this bank is suspicious. What did Asia Universal Bank do? Well, it hired a DC-based PR company, APCO Worldwide, who managed to get Bob Dole on the board. Immediately, this opened doors for the banks. It then established many correspondent relationships with other banks across the world, which basically allowed Bakiev and his associates to launder money. And the bank was later shown really to be basically a money laundering vehicle. Karimova, the company Kvostals, was the solicitor in charge. She was using a proxy, her boyfriend, Rustam Madumarov, to basically hide the ownership of the house. But information had started to come out about the fact that she and her boyfriend were in cahoots and were involved in various shady business, including the receipt of these suspicious payments from the telecoms companies. But somehow the house was still managed to be sold by the solicitor's firm. We don't know quite what due diligence was performed, but nonetheless, as John was saying, in terms of are the people compliant? You can be still compliant. You might be able to file a suspicious activity report. You've done your legal duties, and yet still the house was sold. The indulgence has been successful, and Mohammed Amersi uses various companies, various high-powered London legal firms to threaten people, and he was partially successful in his indulgence in that he sued somebody who had shared a critical note about him in private emails, but he lost that libel case. But it was successful in that it would have had a chilling effect over what is being reported about Mohammed Amersi. So I think that is it from me. We'll go back to John to go through a different case. This is the case of fixed selling status.
Yeah, so and we're going to move on to this final question of the 4 questions of what are the wider effects here. Important in the 3 cases Tom mentioned just there is none of them were incumbents. Bakiev and Karimova was after they lost power, after Karimova was already under investigation and house arrest in Uzbekistan, after the Bakiev regime had fallen in Kyrgyzstan in 2010. And Mercy is actually a British citizen and an enabler himself, as well as someone who accessed these services. So perfectly able to access all of this without the incumbency advantage. So that more general picture then that we find is one of the enabler effects. So I'm really going to focus on that in this final question about the effects. So we can talk. What are the wider effects? Who are those effects upon? There's a variety of foci of subjects we could think about here. One of them, of course, is the university. So the UK doesn't have quite as big a private donations market as Harvard, certainly, and the US more generally. I suspect the philanthropic funding to UK universities outside of Oxford and Cambridge is smaller than to the entirety of Harvard. I haven't checked that. But the UK is certainly the nearest to the US in terms of all European countries, in terms of receipt of philanthropic funds of donations. And it's generally a relatively poorly regulated environment. I know here that's been very politicized with the implementation of the Education Act, particularly under the first Trump administration, where certain universities were targeted for not reporting donations. In the UK, there's almost no regulation of this at all. Something has just been introduced. It hasn't been implemented yet. And it's very, very, very weak. So you'll even get like the Russell Group universities, that's the equivalent of UK elite universities, for those of you who don't know the British system, such as our own University of Exeter, who don't have an independence gifts committee to assess donations. They just have ad hoc senior management approval processes, no transparency around the criteria they're using. And then you've got institutions which receive many more donations, like Oxford, who do have a dedicated independent gifts committee, but it doesn't necessarily always function perfectly. I'm aware we have a former member of that gifts committee here present with us, so that might be a conversation later. But I'm going to go through one example we have in the book, which is this one. It's quite close to home. We didn't set out to try and do this case study, but kind of fell into it really. And I do know one or two of the persons involved in this personally, so it's a little bit awkward. So this is a receipt of a £10 million donation to Oxford to establish a centre for the study of Azerbaijan in Central Asia. It's the largest donation to Central Asian studies in the UK ever. And we don't know who it's from. What we do know is Nargiz Pashayev, the sister-in-law of the president of Azerbaijan, is on the board. So if we start we have these charts, which are very complicated. They try and show the connections between sometimes flat out money laundering and some of the more reputational services. And that's what this one shows. So if we start in the top left there, you see Nargiz, who is an academic. I'm sorry, I can't say that quite seriously because she also runs a fashion brand and has lifestyle magazines, which is not something I've ever really thought of branching out into myself as an academic. Most important thing is that she's part of the Aliyev Pashayev ruling family. And there's various sort of members there up in the top left that are part of that board too, politicians, Lord Malcolm Bruce, various academics, and a professional service provider who's Azeri origin but based in London and has been involved in a number of money laundering cases, Rabban Maramov, who helped, we think, set up the British Foundation for the Study of Azerbaijan and the Caucasus. So on the top there, I guess is kind of what we know about donations that have occurred in the past, because Iskandar Khalilov, who's a former vice president of Lukoil, the Russian oil company, has been publicly acknowledged as a previous donor, very closely tied to Ilham Aliyev himself and to the wider Aliyev Pashayev family. Oxford took this money with a non-disclosure agreement. So even though journalists have petitioned the Information Commissioner in the UK to make the donor public, they have refused that, understandably, having signed an NDA. So we don't know who the donor is. The position of the Information Commissioner is that because the public research outputs of the centre are things that can be read, therefore we can assess whether there's any undue authoritarian influence on the centre. Anyone who thinks seriously about academic freedom knows it's about inputs as well as outputs. There are topics that are studied and topics that are not studied because of those inputs and sources of funding. And more importantly, there's just a couple of steps away from a wider reputation laundering exercise that is going on here. So Nargis Pashaeva is the daughter of Arif Pashayev, who is the nominee owner of a large portion of around about $700 million worth of real estate in London. He's linked, and they are linked more broadly to the Azerbaijani laundromat, which is a wider process of laundering money, but also reputations. The centre at Oxford is named after Nizami Ganjavi, which, if you know Azerbaijan, is the brand used by the regime to promote the country globally. So there are serious questions here, I think, about the selling of status, perhaps not influence, but it may be status which is most important here. And what's really interesting about this case is it's one that is occurring without third-party enablers. So to the best of our knowledge, there isn't a fixer in the middle here. If the enabling is occurring, it's occurring within the recipient, i.e. Oxford. So I'll leave that at that. I'll say a few more things. I think we've gone to 45 minutes, and I want to give plenty of time for sort of questions. We don't find much evidence of the alliance effect, but I think most people coming into this would think there would be quite a strong one. Mainly thinking about the use of sanctions. Part of our reasoning for that is that we've just got so many cases here of Russians and other non-partner elites being indulged. And the fact that very late in the day, mainly from 2022, some sanctions began to occur, isn't really evidence of the alliance effect. And it is, to use an English metaphor, very much shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. The UK followed the Magnitsky sanctions trend. You see the US there and its wide usage, but the UK didn't really use them at all until 2022 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And one of the most, which may be known to you, telling examples of how, well, they're really the incoherence of UK foreign policy was when in 2018, Theresa May was announcing in Parliament diplomatic expulsions of Russians from embassies, not just in the UK, but all over the world, 3 days after the Salisbury poisonings, where Russian used chemical weapons about 50 miles from where I live in Exeter to go after Sergei Skripal and led to the death of British citizen Dawn Sturgis. Gazprom was having a bond sale on the London stock markets where UK financial services were helping them raise $750 million, which no doubt helped Russian rearmament as it was proceeding towards the war in Ukraine. Mikhail Martin there also used the language of indulgence. So broadly, the alliance effect doesn't really hold across this terrain. There's some evidence, and I will bring this to a conclusion. I'm not going to fully explain this one, but we can talk about it a little bit in the questions if you want, where alliances occur through the private sector and professional services. This is our case of corporate intelligence. And there's a great deal here of UK Kazakh and even US Kazakh relations, which are occurring through private sector transactions. That might include those of real estate transactions, but it also includes the provision of corporate intelligence services. For many years, a key objective of Kazakhstan's foreign policy was going after Mukhtar Ablyazov, and it did so through Western professional services firms, particularly Arcanum Global, but also its lawyers, Boyce Schiller, US firm mentioned there, UK firms too, the UK office of Boyce Schiller involved in this as well. So, you know, there is an effect of UK and US private sector firms helping Kazakhstan achieve a foreign policy ends, but it's occurring, as I say, primarily in the private sector, possibly with some whistling approval by the state. But really, we're trying to tell a somewhat different story here, which is not the traditional geopolitical story. And it's about these intimate connections between democracies and autocracies. Again, not really time to fully explain this. And this is an image which Alexander Cooley produced around the time of the previous book that I mentioned, Dictators Without Borders, which is about the selling of Donald Trump Soho property in New York to Kazakh oligarchic exile figures in this case, a couple not more terribly as of. So finally, Trump gets a mention, but again, it's these business and private sector connections which seem to be crucial in explaining the kind of relationships which are emerging between two countries. So finally, I'm really always struck by the 2 January 6. So here we'll be familiar with the January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C. And January 6, 2022 was actually for a few days in early January 2022, but I think that's photos taken from January 6, where you have a popular revolt in Kazakhstan, which is partly a rebellion against a kleptocratic form of rule under Nazarbayev. It was a number of things, but that's one of the things it was. And here you've got a rebellion in support of someone who, I have to be direct, is a supplier of services to kleptocrats. That's how he made his money in real estate and to a variety of clients, but it's very well documented. I'm not here talking about Russiagate and all that. This is his making of money out of real estate in that way. So, this is speculative, but this kind of politics, linking the United States and Kazakhstan, linking the UK and Russia, or the UK and Azerbaijan, is one which brings to mind apocalyptic futures. So just summarizing, actually, it kind of summarizes some of the things we've said. Maybe I'll finish, just so we do finish, with the final paragraph of the introduction. And it's partly because it gives us a slightly more positive note than some of the things I've been saying so far. So we agree that sensible people can come to different views on the importance of and damage done by professional indulgences. However, we think it is irrefutable that our world is being transformed by the global power of mobile capital, which is opening new spaces for elites in a world in which nation states were, for a late modern moment in the 20th century, territorially distinct and empowered by decolonization and democratization. Perhaps this resurgence of elite networks of wealth and power is a return to the normal pattern of modern history, but such a broad brush dismissal is unwarranted. The professionals of our book are individuals who exercise moral and intellectual agency in their choices of whom to work for and how to indulge them. The UK's private sector has many thousands of them in the service of oligarchs and kleptocrats, and it should be no surprise that they have their own moral and professional justifications for their actions. So far, those that have resisted or blown the whistle appear to have lost ground to those who have indulged kleptocracy. However, there are also many individuals and organizations with the agency to expose and fatally undermine these indulgences. There is not yet a definitive winner or loser in the fight for and against kleptocracy. So I will finish there, and with discount code if you feel so moved to buy a hard copy.
Thank you so much, John and Tom. Can I ask a couple of questions and then open the floor?
Sure.
Yeah, one is a small one, actually. You showed the table in which you assess the level that strong with, and I was surprised to see weak in the line for selling status, because you talk in the book about public relations companies, that help to shape the image and all that. So I was wondering why you put weak here in this table.
Yeah.
The second question is on kind of also in the book when you discuss the kind of the origins of Londongrad, and I thought it was really, really super interesting. You talk about the decline of the British Empire, kind of with these global networks that kind of remained while they kind of the empire itself disappeared, and then you connected to the dissolution of the Soviet Empire and how in the end kind of all these neoliberal policies and kind of combined, and you ended up with Londongrad. And I was wondering which big trends you kind of see now, right, with the with what's happening inside UK politics, domestic politics, with the split between Russia and the West, with what is happening on this side of the pond, and kind of Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you discern there? And third is with universities. That's something very close to to our heart, right? You talked about the the center, right? At Oxford, and you do mention it in the book that these are under-resourced areas of studies, right? And you do need the money for them.
Yeah.
Where do you find the money, right? It's very difficult to find money in the region that is kind of not, not problematic, right? So what do you do? Isn't it kind of in the end better to have some money? Maybe it's a little bit questionable, but you use it for a good cause, right? And you talk about indulgences, and kind of historically, not a very good money was used to create something, kind of pieces of architecture, some libraries and kind of good things. So what's your take on it? What should universities do?
Sure.
And especially like if you're doing Central Asian studies, what would you do?
Yeah.
What would be your advice to us? Because we do need funding. And yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. On the selling status one, I think there is a question mark on that one, because I think what we're trying to say is that you can donate to political parties, you can donate to universities just personally, and that's what a lot of people would think about doing. But as you suggest, there may be a hidden hand behind that. There may be a PR company saying, what would be very good if you start doing this kind of donation. It's just that they're not as seen as the other enablers. We had a case we mentioned in the book with Dmitry Leos, who's this Russian Turkmen banker who arrived in the UK, and it was clear he was going for British citizenship. And all of a sudden, all these articles start popping up in newspapers with kind of ad content paid for at the beginning, and it's like kind-hearted Leos donates to Children's Hospital, and then he donates to Prince Charles, King Charles, his foundation. He donates to the Conservative Party as well. Clearly, somebody behind him was going, this is what you do to get citizenship. You show yourself not to be a money launderer. You show yourself to be a philanthropist. But we don't know who that was. So that's why it's kind of a bit weak. But I think probably you're right that there is an enabling effect there. We just don't know.
The key thing here, and these are the two chapters. So selling status is the universities one, making friends is political donations. Thomas just touched on that. Both of them get coded as weak for the enabler effect, because the evidence for third-party enabling is weak. We have to infer from the outcomes that within the recipient organizations, there was a certain amount of, indulgence. And we can see some evidence of that. But because of the way we are conceptualizing the enabler effect, we're talking about it as a third-party effect. So this was an interesting and unexpected finding, that you could have indulgence, even though there's weakness across all these effects. And it seems to be a great deal about very poor regulation of those organizations and high levels of incentives to take the money. That gets onto your question about universities. It's important that I've had extended conversations with the people involved in this at Oxford, who are my personal friends and intellectual colleagues going back 20 years. We're not making an argument against receipt of such funds. What we're saying is, if you're going to do that, you shouldn't sign NDAs, and you need to be absolutely upfront and transparent about where the money comes from, and almost quite active. If you're essentially taking money from someone who's, we don't know, obviously, but probably a key member of the Azerbaijani kleptocratic elites, which is, in government terms, one of the hardest autocracies and kleptocratic systems in the world, then I think you need to be quite active about ensuring that the center includes research which explores that. So it's not about, if you're Oxford or Harvard, I think you can set terms for which you receive money. That's what university gifts committees and offices should be doing. People want to come here. They want to give money here. right? And so the university managers and gifts committees that make these decisions could, I think, be a little bit more active in insisting on certain kinds of freedoms and, just being upfront in the conversation that if you are of that kind of background and you're funding a center in Azerbaijan and Central Asia, that's necessarily going to include some topics which you as a donor may not be happy about. I don't see the evidence that occurred in this case, and the non-disclosure agreement is just, I think, extremely problematic.
Okay.
That's what we say in the book. And then trends. So the big trend in this world is a big shift to Dubai and other so-called new service center providers. The thing what Dubai doesn't have is it doesn't have the old world status, and it doesn't have Oxford and Cambridge. It doesn't have the royal family. It doesn't have London shopping. It doesn't have British private schools. It doesn't have this wider array because it isn't just economic, as we're trying to say. It's social. So I think places like the UK, the US, France, many of Switzerland, they still have these things to offer. And if you do see a move away, Biden had a big anti-corruption strategy, which very much focused on kleptocracy. Trump's done an about turn on that. So you could very easily see, certainly in the US, a big inflow of kleptocratic wealth. So that could be a trend in the future. And it's clearly the case that the crackdown of the last 4 to 5 years really is part of what's led to so much, I think, going to Dubai and some other centers. So the trends at the moment are a bit up in the air, but the trend that we see, other people's research really, is this move. Particularly Dubai and Hong Kong actually would be the two big centers.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open the floor. Okay, we are on record, so it's up to you to introduce yourself.
My name is Bruno. Basically, school of Pakistan. It's a very interesting insightful research. So my question is, do you think we can differentiate between petty kleptocracy and grand kleptocracy? Second question is regarding from police perspectives. Do you think how they know that they are faced with uncertainties, ambiguities, and imperfect information? What are those measures that they will apply in order to minimize the risks to tackle the circumstances?
On the first question, I think often when you have they often go hand in hand. You have the petty kleptocracy and the grand corruption. But what we're interested in is where it is systemic, and Kazakhstan is a great example of that. The more you look at Kazakhstan, you take a company, it's a company you've not heard of before, you start investigating it, which is something I've done for 20 years. You will find a link to the president, certainly the former president. You will find, who is this person? It is somebody who is a business partner of one of the daughters or someone's son-in-laws. This isn't a matter about, a politician getting his, son a cushy job, but this is what the whole political economy is based on, and I think that is why our focus has been on the top level scandals.
Yeah, and we're not looking at the kind of like playing bribes to the traffic policeman to kind of get down the road. That's different on a different level, and I don't think that's necessarily linked to kleptocracy in any way. That I think that is different. So your second question, I think you said minimize the risk. Were you thinking very much in terms of sort of the Tokayev administration coming in, not with the same baggage as Nazarbayev's, wanting to be explicit about wanting to recover assets and crack down on corruption? Was that the question? Yeah. So how do we interpret the last 3 years in particular in Kazakhstan? I mean, there's other people here that may be better to do that than the two of us, actually, particularly you, Narkis, actually. But it's what we see, I think, is a series of deals being done. So there's clearly people they've gone after, like Masimov and Beketayev, and then there are people that are just too big, like Kulibayev, to touch, right? And so there's been a shifting around and moving around of assets. So the first thing that's happening isn't good governance and democratic reform. It's about the allocation of power, and power means wealth as well in this context. And so you're getting a little bit of shuffling of the pack. And obviously we're hearing reporting now in the last month of Kulibayev having to do a kind of Putin and the oligarchs kind of deal with Tokayev and pay into the system. It just doesn't seem possible, I think, to govern without having built up some kind of set of clientelistic relations, right? So therefore, if you are Tokayev and Tokayev's people, if you are some of the technocrats there, I have students who have come out of that system. They want to reform it. I know there are many, many people who have real aspirations to improve the system and to reduce the excesses that we had under Nazarbayev. But there are some pretty big untouchables, right? And I've mentioned one of them already, an individual. And there are others, I think. But I think it's reasonable to talk about different levels of, we're not trying to explain different types of regime, as I said at the start, but you can get a calcified kleptocratic system like Equatorial Guinea or something, where it is really just about constant theft. And I think, limiting it so it's possible to have a small and medium enterprise, which will probably have to pay off some people in the state and engage in petty corruption, but you don't need a kind of core political connection to do that business, is possible. And I think that's probably the kind of system. But we don't have policy advice on how to bring that about. That's not really what the book's about. But I think those degrees do matter. Mm-hmm. And I think, Kazakhstan's in a better place now than it was. I think that can say that much at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Rafał Soborekov very interesting book. Maybe I have not read the book, and I don't know, maybe you covered it or not. So traditionally, UK, as I understand, has been a magnet for this kind of people, right? So 90s, oligarchs, so Soviet Union. Before that, it was Middle East and Gulf, people coming in. So it's kind of traditional. So I'm wondering, with all this kind of kleptocratic, not very kind of clean money coming into the country, and you mentioned also during the, our talk that you might actually presented this book in the parliament. I wonder if there is it seems like it's systemic. It seems like UK is magnet for this kind of, right? So is it, and you also mentioned about enabling effect, right? Enablers effect. So I wonder if there is a discussion in UK in the parliament. Maybe you discussed it, but maybe you discussed it during your presentation in the parliament. Is it going to change? Is British government interested in kind of confronting this military ideal situation? It's not clearly built in by most.
Yeah.
Can I go first?
Yeah, go first.
I think we're US versus UK. We are at different ends at the moment on this. David Lammy, who's our secretary, foreign secretary, he basically, there was a video of him outside Dmitry Firtash's house, who's a Ukrainian oligarch linked to Russia, saying, I've sanctioned this man. We're clamping down on kleptocratic flows or dirty cash. So
he was outside the tube station.
He was outside, but that's where they do.
The British Ministry of Defence sold him a underground.
Sold Firtash basically a tube station, which became part of this guy's house. And Lammy's actually went there to film. So they're saying the right things, and I think in our conversations they are interested in understanding this issue of kleptocracy more, but things just seem to change so slowly. Our company registration system, Companies House, finally it used to be £12 to register a company in the UK, and so you have like thousands of companies being registered in the UK from overseas because they're fantastic vehicles to launder money. You don't have a bank account in the UK, you just have a UK company and you have the bank account in Latvia. Finally, now it's £50, and they've brought in some, legislation where you have to have a passport verification. But so what if it's a Chinese passport and you're not going to go after somebody in China for registering a British company? So it doesn't really solve the problem. And this is something you kind of bang your head against so many times. It's, we don't want to stop Britain being, a good place to do business, not realizing that this has nothing to do with British business. Okay, so you're getting a few fees for British companies being registered here, but the bank accounts are outside of the UK. It's transnational. And it's dirty money. So even if some of it passes through the UK, it's not really benefiting the UK as a whole. Have they kind of realized that yet? Perhaps to a certain extent, this government, but it's slow going still.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned systemic, and that kind of gets at this, right? And Nargis talked about the British Empire. I mean, we could go back to the fact that the British Empire in India was a private sector operation until the Indian Mutiny in the mid-19th century, or the Hudson Bay Company or something. You look at the way that the private sector is involved in these supposedly core tasks of statecraft. I think the most important historical circumstances to go to think about this are the role of, how the offshore system in the British overseas territories emerged as a kind of British nonchalance towards, like the Foreign Office said, yeah, we're not going to regulate these territories. They can run tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. So that was really, really important, because that was key to the unraveling of the only real system we've had of proper capital controls, which, was generated under Bretton Woods and the influence of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, and then unraveled within 20 years because the bankers and the financial people didn't like it. And so since then, really, you've had a deregulatory system moving towards a self-regulatory system. And the key point of the book is that when you shift that amount of power into the private sector, you can't just get it back as a state, right? So one of the responses of reviewers to the book at review stage was, it's kind of like what you said, this is just a British malaise. But yes, but two things. One, when you have that, you can't just, as a state, regulate it out of existence. And secondly, what we're saying, we can't, this is by implication because of the scope of the book, but Britain is just a fairly extreme case, because it's a G7 economy which is doing this, not the St. Kitts and Nevis itself, or, I don't know, Delaware, part of the United States or something. It's an extreme case, but it is really emblematic of something which is truly global. It is Hong Kong, Dubai, Singapore, it is Switzerland, it is overseas territories, it is parts of the United States, like Delaware and North Dakota, that have been doing this for a very, very long time. So it's an acute example of something that's far, far more widespread.
Okay, well, people are preparing the questions. I was struck by the slide where you juxtapose the 6th of December in Kazakhstan and 6th of December in the US.
January.
And I was thinking that, yes, definitely both are linked to kleptocracy, but at the same time, money likes silence, as they say in Russia, right? So kind of it's interested in the preserving the status quo, right? Kind of having normal course of events. And both events here, they're definitely linked to kleptocracy, but that's the moment when people with money wanted a disruption, basically, right? So they wanted to kind of disrupt the normal political processes, right? So kind of, I mean, so I was thinking, to what extent you can kind of link kleptocracy with apocalyptic future? You see what I mean? Kind of, you do want, peace and quiet and beauty, your streets, and kind of you have your lavish lifestyle, and you don't want this kind of stuff, but certain moments you do want, right?
I mean, it is suggestive, you're right, and no more than that. It's a sort of rhetorical flourish at the end of the presentation, quite possibly influenced as much by the fact that the other book I've written in the last few years was a work of political theology. And so the apocalyptic, for me, I found, like, writing the two books at the same time just was intellectually quite engaging and led me to think about whether there's an apocalyptic aspect here. I think the claim, and this is very much my slide, I think the claim being made by it is that kleptocratic forms of rule need to disrupt democracy. They can't allow it.
Right.
You know, and as you alluded to at the start, you know, when you start closing down Department of Justice anti-kleptocracy initiatives, suspend the FCPA, that's just a vivid illustration of that. But if you want to move money around, transfer it, make sure the checks on it aren't too great, make sure business can be done. You know, democracy is a system which is about trying to equalize relations and set standards and rules. So those with wealth acquired by any means can't just do what they want. So there's this point of tension. So, you know, if in countries where there is a struggle in Kazakhstan on the part of many people to establish a more democratic system, the United States obviously has a long history of democracy. Those two things are obstacles to those who are engaged in kleptocracy, as we understand it. And, you know, I think the way it goes is, as you say, most of the activity will occur in silence, but at times you need to disrupt by being directly violent and intrusive.
No, that's why I was struck. I think
that's
definitely onto something.
But it's suggestive, no more than that.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm with the RICA program at Davis Centre. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you, in the course of this research, engaged a lot with the private sector enablers on this topic and what their response has been. Like, is there an outright denial of what they're doing, a post-talk about rationalization? Just interested in what that conversation's been like.
Sure, it depends which sector. So the PR sector, I did a paper on the PR industry, and you know, they were very, very supportive, and we got the two biggest PR membership bodies, you know, getting me in for talks and, you know, interviewing them. We interviewed real estate agents, and I think the issue there was this is just not really an issue that a lot of people come across, but it's very important. Lawyers, on the other hand, haven't reacted so kindly to this, and there is definitely a kind of a methinks the lady doth protest too much with the legal sector. You know, they start off by saying, well, you know, this is a very, you know, a lot of lawyers will never work with these kind of issues, which is true, obviously, if you're a lawyer working on copyright law. But I think that's obviously we're not talking about that. Then they'll say, oh, it's just a question of rooting out the 2 or 3 bad apples, and you know, if you know, if the police just do their job and we uncover those people and sanction them, then we've solved the problem. This whole area of where you can be, you know, enabling kleptocracy, but actually compliant with your, you know, in regards to the law and the regulations, is a concept that they just do not want to deal with whatsoever, and I think they are in denial about it. A certain section of the legal services. It's, you know, I'm doing my job. I have clients. You know, what do you want me to do? But they're not thinking that this is actually quite a new thing relatively. You know, there's always been corruption, but actually leaders stealing it and placing it in the, you know, in the UK with help from the professional services, that's basically, you know, a post-war thing. It's less than 100 years old, and I think they haven't got to grips with that at all.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes, we've spoken to many professionals in most of these sectors. Most of it isn't formal interviewing, because these kind of conversations aren't the kind of thing where you sign up to a consent form or do the kind of things that IRBs, University Ethics Committees want you to do. But it's lots of informal conversations to get a contextual background and hear. And obviously we did the formal opportunity to comment process, which is often with lawyers, you're right into the lawyer of a person or a bank or something. So from the lawyers, as Tom was saying, you get this kind of defensiveness. From the other sectors, I think, and I'll say something more about that in a moment, but from the other sectors, we're often talking to people who see problems in their sector, know there's some really problematic companies. They themselves are really interested in this. We present to them sometimes as like a group of due diligence, political risk analysis professionals in London working on the form Soviet Union called Sodrujstva, go and speak there, things like this. And there's some great people there. And they're aware of problems across the sector. Some cases they're aware of things their own companies have done they're not necessarily happy with, but some partners signed off on. So that they're therefore interested. So the important thing here is that it's easy to see this as a bad apples problem. It isn't. You know, if the big four accountancy firms, the top three consultancies, they've all been implicated in this. Outside of this region, like Bain and McKinsey in South Africa recently. So it is much more systemic. But there's a mix. That was the paragraph I read towards the end. You know, there's people taking different choices and there's people leaving. A lot of the people that know about this the most are people who've kind of worked in the sector, left it because they just can't really cope with the kind of compromises involved in it. And they'd rather have a certain amount of integrity rather than the wealth that goes with it, if I can be blunt about it. On the lawyers, there's two classic arguments being used, I think. One is attorney-client privilege. Problem with that one is that before onboarding a client, you're supposed to do due diligence, which they don't appear to be doing. Plus, there's some key firms that are just obviously working high-risk clients from our region. I'll be careful what I say on camera, but I will just mention the case anyway. The Tena Prelec case, where a legal firm sued a British researcher from Bellingcat, Elliot Higgins, for saying that Prigozhin, in 2021, saying that Prigozhin was the leader of Wagner Corporation. And they claimed there was some public speculation that that might be the case. The public speculation would have included any major academic and think tank report on Prigozhin predating 2021 and the fact that he was sanctioned by the US for that in 2018. You know, what's going on? They need to do, before they go into attorney-client privilege, due diligence to onboard clients. So that's one thing. And the other thing is a complete misuse of what's called the cab rank rule among barristers. So if you're taking a criminal case, a murder trial, you know, you're a barrister, you're at the bar, you take the next case that comes along. These are civil law cases, by and large. The cab rank rule does not apply, but you'll hear lawyers invoking that to justify. And these are, I mean, this to me suggests there's a massive problem around legal ethics. I have a colleague at Exeter who's a specialist in legal ethics, and we talk a lot about this. There is the market, and these massive firms, multi-billion-dollar law firms, they're being led much more by market incentives, I think, than sort of professional standards in a lot of this onboarding of clients that we're talking about.
Did you have the blessing of IRB office or not?
Well, you see, because it's almost all legal documents and financial documents. It's not human subjects research.
For interviews, you had to.
For interviews, formal interviewing is specific areas. So, for example, we got permission to interview real estate agents.
Okay.
Not about cases they work on, but hypothetical risk scenarios. Would you take a client in this case? Also in some other professions. Yeah. So if you're not asking them of why did you do this for this person, but working with like vignette or scenario-based interviewing, you can get permission. Colleagues have had permission, at least in the UK and in the US, for deception-based exercise. So some of the best research in this area is like, you may be aware of Mike Finley and Dan Nielsen at UT Austin and Jason Sharman, our colleague at Cambridge, doing these field experiments where they essentially send emails that I am the Nigerian, I'm a friend of the Nigerian oil minister, will you set up an offshore company for me?
Yeah.
It's completely deceptive, but you can get permission for that. So there's certain things, forms of like direct interaction with professionals that you can get permission for it. But most of the higher risk stuff we weren't doing for this book. You didn't really need to. But we were doing a lot of conversation, which wasn't, and that's not quoted in here. It's just background material.
Hi, my name is Danny, and I'm also in the master's program. I must say, it was a very conflicting feeling to see an alumni of the program, Karima, in your presentation. So, you know, there is that. But I digress. I wanted to ask you for maybe your top 3 policy recommendations for the government to maybe help us as you look at the book.
There are 5 in the conclusion.
We can extend the list.
Chapter 14 is how to indulge no more. So yeah, I'm trying to remind myself of the 5. Do you remember them?
Well, I can start with one. I'm sure it's in there. You know, if we,
We'll look at it on the Harvard website.
Excellent.
you know, if you look at the UK versus the US, you know, traditionally you would say that, you know, the US has weaker money laundering regulations than the UK. You know, there's no requirement for real estate agents to do due diligence and report suspicions, for example. Yet, why is it that all of the Russian oligarchs, well, many of the Russian oligarchs and all the Kazakhs in these areas, they bought houses in London rather than, by and large, America? There's one or two exceptions. I know Gulnare's sister has some property in California, I think it is, but it's majority is the UK, and I think that's because of question of enforcement that, okay, it's changing now, but traditionally US has had a very, you know, strong Department of Justice who has gone after Gulnara Karimova. It was the DOJ who went after Gulnara first, provoked this massive international investigation. It was DOJ who froze Pavlo Lazarenko's house, former Prime Minister of Ukraine. This deterrent effect, I think, had massive deterrent on oligarchs. They thought, well, especially, you know, another case, the James Giffen case, the fixer for Nazarbayev. After that happened, the Kazakhs thought, well, maybe we shouldn't be putting our money in the US. So short answer, yeah, enforcement, and to do that, you have to really fund your law enforcement agencies, and the UK hasn't really done that. So you can introduce all these new laws and explain wealth orders. They're kind of useless if you don't enforce them, and that's why the UK has fallen down.
A couple of other things, which are the first two of the five. If you can designate kleptocracy as serious and organized crime, that would be very, very helpful. There's some legal attempts to do that. The Swiss are doing something actually with Karimova, the prosecution, not of her, but the people around her, like the office, they call it. But if you know, part of the way that so much action can be taken against terrorist networks isn't just because they're securitized to such a high level, but you can actually name and designate a terrorist organization. And it's similar with organized crime. You know, you can say this is cartel, this group. So can you do that with kleptocratic networks of the type we're talking about? Can you take a group of individuals around a political elite and do that? It's quite hard legally, but at least post hoc, I think it's the Swiss are trying to do it. So there's some criminologists that have this idea of being able to designate kleptocratic enterprises. If you could do that, that would change the game, I think, potentially, for at least for prosecutors. The second thing is actually to introduce a criminal liability offence for corporate officers for taking on clients. So there's a failure to prevent fraud offence in the UK, but not a failure to prevent money laundering. And when you have these, usually they have massive carve-outs. So the key people that are making the money and taking the decisions aren't held liable. But, you know, if McKinsey's paying bribes in South Africa, then the partner there should be criminally liable for that. But that's not what happens. Maybe it will be, because South Africa might change its law at some point, but it would require national jurisdictions to introduce those kind of corporate officer criminal liability offences. And, you know, if they were serious about this, they would do that. So the fact that very few, I don't really know of any, have done that is telling.
Okay, I think that's an excellent point to end our session, our